Hey, what's up, everyone? DREAGEN here, back again to tell you that you should be watching Cronos. So Cronos is a 1993 Mexican horror film written and directed by now acclaimed Guillermo del Toro, who a lot of you probably recognize the name from movies like Pan's Labyrinth, Hellboy, Pacific Rim, Crimson Peak, so on and so forth. But this is kind of where he got started. This was kind of his first official foray, if you will, into cinema. And basically, the story takes place in Mexico, where he's from, and is kind of a reinterpretation of the vampire mythos, something that he would become, he would play around with throughout his career, most notably when he did Blade 2. But in this film, he kind of takes the concept of what a vampire is and it kind of tweaks it. He includes kind of elements of alchemy, making a vampire more of a transformative allegory, if you will, rather than just someone becoming a blood-sucking monster, even though he does do that later on in his career. But in this film, it questions the notion of what a vampire is, what it represents to us, and interestingly enough, what we as humanity represent to vampires. It forces you to kind of ask a question that we've brought up on this show before, is that what makes a monster a monster? Usually vampires are always, depicted as kind of these predatory, dangerous, not friend to humanity kind of creatures. And this film does touch upon that. However, it plays around with the idea of need versus want. And I know that might sound kind of weird, but I'll explain. The vampires need to feed. Yes, they need to drink blood. This is something that's not excluded from this incarnation of what a vampire is. However, unlike previous incarnations where it's always implied that the vampire is only going to acquire that which it needs through predatory means, meaning, if you give it a pint of blood in a glass, it's not the same as biting into someone's neck, whereas realistically speaking, if you're someone who eats meat, well, do you need to go and just stab a cow in the neck and rip out its, throat and then just eat it like that? Or would a steak at a restaurant suffice? Just because you need to eat something, a certain kind of thing, doesn't mean you need to employ violence to do so. It's just, a means to an end. If there's a much simpler means and non-violent one to get it, hey, why the hell not? And that's kind of what this film touches upon. It shows him acquiring blood. It shows him feeding and sustaining kind of his new biology, if you will, through more non-violent means. Meanwhile, there are kind of nefarious forces, amongst the human community who are trying to acquire that which he has kind of by accident, for their own personal gain. In particular, one man who's basically sick and old and dying, and he's trying to become immortal. And through this, he's employing very dastardly means in which to get this power that this man has discovered. And it kind of shows you, here's a man who's human, who on the surface has more in common with probably everyone who's watching this video, and yet is far more of a monster than the monster who is going out of his way to kind of protect his grandchild, to protect his family, to try to not get them involved with this. And, ultimately when they kind of realize what he is, weirdly enough, embrace it. They kind of, the whole notion of this family kind of closes ranks around him. And it essentially, without really spoiling things at the end, because I don't want to give away the ending, but I'll try to walk a fine line here, basically shows that at the end of the day, the outside and, what we need to do to survive, it more comes down to how we acquire it. It really doesn't matter if you have to eat a steak or drink blood. The question is not what are you eating to survive, but how do you get it? Are you going out there killing and murdering? Or are you essentially acquiring blood the same way we would acquire food? You go out there, you get it through non-violent means and to sustain yourself. You're trying to survive. You're trying to live. But doesn't mean you have to hurt someone to do so. And there is a moment where the vampire is confronted with kind of this instinct, this need to feed, and he's looking at his grandchild, and it's like, is he going to? And then he stops himself, and he catches himself. And in that moment, he chooses, basically realize that humanity is not a visual aesthetic. Who he is as a man is not how he survives. It's the choices he makes. It's how he goes about doing what he needs to survive. And that's what it's about when now you're confronted with this human character who is trying to survive, trying not to die, and essentially trying to obtain immortality to, stave off death. But it is the means in which he employs to achieve that. And it's kind of like kind of by an any means necessary mentality. But so even if he is successful, at what cost? Are you still a man at that point? Are you still a human? Are you now a monster for having used those methods, those means to acquire this life-saving, thing? Whereas the monster, has become something biologically speaking anyway, very different from a human being, and yet it conducts itself like a human being. It behaves like a human being. It goes out of its way to not hurt others the way human beings should. And that basically, again, brings up the whole notion of what is a monster, which, again, is something we've talked about on the show before. Is it just what you look like and what you are, or is what you do? Have huge teeth and claws and breathe fire and, bleed acid or whatever. But if you're kind and compassionate and you're taking into consideration the well-being of others, are you really a monster, even though aesthetically you have all this stuff about you? Or could you look like a completely well-adjusted member of society, but be out there hurting or worse, killing people just so you can gain something? Is that a monster? And that is what this film really, asks you, the audience. And that's what Del Toro a lot of times does in his films, is that he confronts you with, kind of a status quo or kind of a visual aesthetic that you have kind of been preconditioned to have an opinion on, and then ask you, but is that really right? Is the monster really the monster in this situation? I mean, sometimes he does, yeah, the monster is a monster, and sometimes he's not above just, making a cool monster movie, but usually there's something more to it, and a lot of times he paints the monster in a sympathetic light, and Guillermo del Toro has kind of famously said that I will not show up to set if there's no monster in my script, because he loves monsters, so it's not uncommon for him to kind of paint the monsters in a sympathetic light, even when they are kind of the villain of the story. He kind of explained that they're not just evil for the sake of evil. But in this film, it's very much asking the question is, what makes someone or anyone a monster? Is it how you look, or is it what you do? And that's the crux of the story, is what it is we do that maybe is what determines what we ultimately are. And again, that's something Del Toro has become very famous for doing in all his work. But yeah, so Cronos, that's kind of what it's all about, is what makes, a man a monster, and what makes a monster a man. And is man really the monster? And is the monster really, the monster? Are these terms interchangeable, or do we need to maybe kind of switch the definitions for each one? Because it's always, a lot of times look in the world, it's always humanity, acting out monstrously. It's always humanity doing monstrous deeds to itself. And a lot of creatures in nature that we would deem as monstrous aren't out to get us. I've never been, at an ATM and been jumped in the middle of the night by a bear, looking to get my wallet. So it's one of those questions of, okay, is our preconceived notions about something really our own opinion of it, or is it something that's just been kind of hammered into us over the years and we've just kind of been conditioned not to question it? And that's what this film wants you to do, is to question that very notion. So with that said, I recommend Cronos, and I want to ask all of you, have you seen it? If so, what did you think? If you haven't, go check it out. Come back, leave some comments below. Let me know what you think. I'll leave some links in the description section where you can pick up the movie and check it out for yourself. And as always, keep checking in for this site for more recommendations on great films and anime. Make sure you check out the You Should Be Reading series, where we'll do the same kind of things with books, comics, manga, so on and so forth. So until next time, guys, we'll catch you in the next one. Peace!